What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So today's video we're going to be talking about a spare rib. People are always asking me, what am I looking for in terms of when a rib is done, when it's ready to wrap, how to trim, and all that kind of stuff. And so this video is going to encompass all that kind of information. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to say is exactly what I would tell someone that I'm working with during a rib shift. So, we're not really talking too much about times and temps so much. It's more so what I'm looking for, the color, the feel. There might be times throughout this video where I'm going to sound really nitpicky because there are certain things that I like seeing in terms of trim, color, feel, and all that kind of stuff. And then there are going to be times where it seems like I'm just winging it, especially when I'm talking about, time and temp. Like, to me, those two things, while they are important, ribs are one of those things that can go many different ways. I think one of the hardest things to cook and make everyone happy with is ribs. The reason why I say that is because, I think in terms of barbecue, ribs is something that almost everybody cooks. People will say like, oh, my ribs are the best, and then their family member, their like uncle or their aunt or their cousin, their grandma also cooks ribs too. So everyone has their own preference. So this video is not a video to be like, this is the way that you should cook ribs. These are certain rules that I follow, and in terms of how you want to take that, is up to you. So don't leave in the comments saying Joe doesn't know how to cook ribs, my ribs are better, because I don't care. This is just a good template for people who are just starting to get into cooking ribs, especially spare ribs. I think most people might be used to cooking, St. Louis ribs, where the rib tip is cut off, and so it's a little bit smaller. But this one I wanted to make sure that we did the full spare and kind of went through the entire process itself. With all that being said, guys, we're going to jump into this video and get straight into the trim. Here we are, we got our full spare rib right here, and again, the knife that we're going to be using is this 10-inch chef's knife. When I'm looking at this rib, I like the amount of marbling that we got going on here. I'm also seeing this top portion right here that is fairly meaty, and I'm sure you guys have heard it a lot that, especially on this kind of butt end right here, we're going to take this meat off from the top, and the reason being is later on, as we go to slice it, when it's done cooking, this meat right here is going to slide off. On this top end where the rib tips are, kind of frayed a little bit, it's pretty thin. We'll try to square that off as much as possible, just to make sure that nothing dries out. Alright, so we'll get started. I like to start on the back side, and usually kind of gives a good indication of what we're dealing with. So right here we got that skirt. We don't really necessarily want that, so what we'll do is we'll make sure we cut that skirt off. Again, just pick it up, run your knife across it. Just gonna save that. Sometimes we'll have this kind of thick layer of fat that's around that that skirt as well. Similar to underside of that brisket, if that fat is really thick underneath, don't try to go and dig it out. Same thing with these ribs. If you end up digging it out, it leaves a pocket that kind of leaves the middle of your rib a little dry. So if it's a little bit thick, just kind of run your knife across and just make the surface nice and even. It's pretty thin up top here. We might have one rib that's a little bit dried in here, but everything else we're gonna try to square it off. Next, after we take off that skirt, we're looking at this breastbone right here. And sometimes you'll, I think at Costco, they sell some pretty meaty St. Louis style ribs, so you won't have to worry about this breastbone right here. Again, that's coming from this portion right up top. Kind of takes some practice to find where that breastbone is, but you can kind of feel with your fingers, and you're just gonna run your knife right across here. And then again, this is why I like using the 10-inch, because it's a little bit thicker and sturdier blade. And then just gonna find it here, and you'll just find that crunch running all the way through, and we're gonna save this as well. The question a lot of people ask is, do you need to take the membrane off? Honestly, I don't. It doesn't really make better ribs, but this one doesn't have it. But sometimes you'll have these big pockets of fat when you go to eat it later on. You don't want your customer or your family member, anyone who is trying to finish the meat that's on the bone, and then you get a big pocket of fat. So what I'll do is pretend there's a pocket of fat here. I'll just take my knife and just kind of poke a hole through it like that. That way when you're cooking and it's rendering down, a lot of fat will hopefully kind of leach out. All right. From here, I'm gonna kind of run my hands across like that, where that top of that rib tip is, like I was talking about the really thin part. What I'm really looking for is like this shape. So if I am looking where you guys are, I want to have a nice even shape. So kind of like when I'm shaping my brisket and I'm running my knife around the edges, that's what I'm doing with this as well. We're going to take off that top, again, save that, and now you got a pretty nice squared even rack of ribs right here. The thickness of the rib is a lot more uniform as well, and you can see that nice marbling that you get on that rib tip section. And the ends right here, it's really up to you whether or not you want to keep these. Generally, if it gets really thin, and also that, you know, that small bone in the end is going to pop out anyway. So generally, what I'll do is, if I'm really trying to make the perfect rack of rib, I'm kind of feeling for the bones on the sides right here, seeing if it is kind of sticking out. This one's not so bad. This one's just really small, and I don't want this end right here to get overcooked when I'm worrying about everything else. Something that I like to do is, and this will kind of help you to figure out if you're doing plates by the bone and stuff like that. When we're counting bones and how many servings that we're going to have, I like to count as many servable bones and big bones as I can. So if I'm counting this one, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 right here. And I would say that one right there, I'm going to make it a little bit meaty, so I'm going to find the most inside part of that small bone and end and cut it down here. That way, this last bone that you have here, it's going to be a nice meatier rib, even though it's on a smaller end. You know, I think your customer will be happy with that. Also on the bottom right here, just kind of finishing touches. Here, this meat is kind of flaying out, so I'm going to just take my knife and cut that off as well. Again, you have to do all this, no, but again, I'm just trying to show you guys like what I'm looking for, what I like to do. That way you kind of get a more uniform shape again. It's all not done, because like I talked about, we got this kind of portion up here. It looks really good, and personally, I really like this portion right here if you can make sure that you don't end up cooking out all this fat. But if you're doing it right, you're most likely going to end up cooking a lot of that fat out in between, and when you go to slice it, it's going to slip and slide, and then like this meat on top tends to be, I don't want to say dry, but the texture is a little bit leaner than it would be here. And then once that slides off, then you have a rib underneath that has no seasoning, that has no sauce, if you add sauce on there. So just gonna try to pinch this right here, and you can kind of see the meat slipping up. I don't really like going too deep. I want a little bit of meat shining through, but I don't want to take out all that fat. You got something like that. So that meat on top right there, it's still good, but again, all that would have most likely just slid off on top. I don't know, this is another thing. Again, I'm just being super picky. Like, as this kind of part is a little bit pointy on that little top corner, I want to be a little bit more smooth, so nitpicky, I know, but I like to make sure that it's nice and uniform all the way across like that, so it's smooth, there's nothing sticking out, not worrying about anything drying out. So that right there for me is a perfectly good trimmed spare rib. So this is kind of like what we're looking for. If you were to go St. Louis style, you would try to, you would flip it right here, kind of find where those top of those bones, end of those bones meet, and then just kind of cut all the way across that cartilage. I don't really love doing that. It ends up making the ribs a little bit too short for my liking. But if you are doing a short cook and you want to just kind of get ribs done, it's actually a pretty effective way to get some, pretty good meaty ribs, because it does have nice marbling on these spare ribs. I'm going to do another quick round of trimming some spare ribs, because I got another one laying around, and I'm not going to really talk through it, but I'm just going to kind of just do it as I would normally do if I was trimming a bunch of them. that's it, guys. That should be as quick as it goes. So even though I explained a lot in the other one, and the other one had a little more work to do because we had that big chunk of fat on top, don't overthink it. I mean, obviously there are steps and things that we need to take care of, but you know, once you kind of get in the groove, boom, you should be knocking out ribs fairly quickly. No more, no less than, you know, I don't know, 3 minutes tops, but I feel like even that's a long time. Just know where you're going with it. You know, again, for me, it's taking off the skirt, taking off the breastbone, taking out the end bones if you need it, flipping it over, looking at what the shape of the, how you want the rib to look, rounding off the top, and then just kind of looking it over again for final, like finishing touches. But other than that, guys, like that's it. I think this one looks a lot better than the other one because it doesn't have that big chunk of fat, but and I think this has a lot of great marbling as well. All right, now let's talk seasoning of these ribs. I'm gonna keep it super simple, just salt and pepper again. There's gonna be no binder, all right? You can use some oil, you can use mustard, but because these are still fairly tacky, I don't feel like I need it. But if you do wanna add some other flavors and stuff like that, go ahead and do it, but for this purpose, I'm not gonna do it. Instead of putting this into a shaker and mixing it all together, I'm gonna do each one separately. For me, the most important thing in terms of visuals for a Texas style spare rib is that evenness of the black pepper. And a lot of times trying to get that evenness done when you have like a shaker, if you're not careful, you can over season that rib, and I don't want it to get super salty. So we're gonna do it individually, and we're just make sure it's quick, easy, and just everything just looks pretty. Because unlike a brisket, this is not gonna take as long in the cook. So because of that, all the seasoning is going to be a little bit more visible. It's not going to create this really, really dark crust. This one we're using Diamond Crystal instead of the Morton's, and we're just going to go nice and light. People ask, do you have to season the backside? Yeah, I mean, you should. Just like in any meat, you should kind of season all sides. Always start with the backside, same thing like you do with brisket. Alright guys, so that's it. I don't know if you can see it in there, but it's nice and even. Black pepper, I know I got a good even coat of salt on there as well. That's it, nice and simple. Most of our flavor is going to come from the smoke, a little bit of sauce, but other than that, you can still eat these as salt and pepper ribs. Like I've done it before, it turns out great, it's delicious. Don't overthink this recipe. Once you're done with this part, it's really smooth sailing from here. Alright guys, so we're going to now talk about kind of placement of ribs inside your smoker. Just kind of like everyone else's, my firebox is on that side right there, and so probably about the first 6 to 8 inches or so is probably like, it's no man's land for ribs. Like you really don't want to put anything there, because if you do, you're gonna have to be moving it around a lot. It's not really and then you're gonna be opening and closing the door a lot. You don't really want that. Unless, I mean, that spot is great for something that you want to get a really quick, maybe you want a little bit more crust on, you want to have a little more texture. But you know, for something like this, we want it to build texture and bark slowly over time. So we're not gonna rush that. Back wall, usually the hottest part for sure. Closer to the door, a little bit cooler. And also in that back corner closest to the stack is usually probably another hot spot. So there are 2 ways that you can position your ribs. Some people like doing it, you know, perpendicular to, you know, the length of the smoker. Other people like it, you know, they like to go parallel with. For the sake of spare ribs, I personally like to go perpendicular, because if you have your ribs spread out like here, and it's long ways like that, this end right here is typically going to cook faster than that back end would. I mean, if you're flipping your ribs during that cook, it's fine. I just don't really want to deal with, you know, turning the ribs that way. It might be beneficial if you have a really uneven rib where one end is really, really thick and one's really, really thin. But I also try to avoid doing all that with the trim itself. That's why we try to, you know, get that rib to be nice and uniform and kind of squared off, so that we're not really dealing with one end being super thick, when I'm being super thin. For this part of the cook right now, I'm gonna have the bones facing towards the fire. All right, so this is the bigger one first, and again, and if you guys couldn't see before, this is kind of like the evenness that I'm talking about, that pepper. It's gonna look great, and it's gonna be one of our indications too of whether or not our ribs are at a certain stage. We're not probing our ribs, we're not doing anything like that. We're doing it by look and color, feel how much that pepper is sticking to the ribs, all that kind of stuff. All right. Now, the one thing that we're gonna kind of keep in mind when you're moving around ribs, do not pull them. If you pull them, you're gonna risk, raking off some of the seasoning in the back end. Like, again, it's not super important there's much seasoning there, but look, presentation, again, it's huge for me. The spot where we took the breastbone off, so it's gonna be right here. We see right here. Generally, I would like those ends closer to the back wall because it's hotter. And these ends are usually where the thicker ribs are. So one thing that we have to make sure that we kind of keep an eye on are these back ribs right here, that they don't end up getting charred too quickly. And especially kind of like, when we're talking about briskets curling up, ribs can curl up too. We try to reduce that with the trim, but it does happen sometimes. And if it does happen, we got to move those ribs. Maybe we got to flip them then. Maybe we turn them parallel with this length of the smoker like I talked about. But it really is adjusting to the cook itself and really knowing, how to navigate through all this. We're not going to spritz. We're not going to do anything. We're going to leave this closed for at least 3 hours. All right, so looking at our spare ribs right now, they're looking pretty good. They're starting to build some color. That those backbones right there aren't curling up, so I know it's not too hot. And look, I know a lot of people at this point right here, I can't really tell, but it is starting to get look a little dry. Now, a lot of people at this point in time, it's probably been an hour and 15 minutes or so in, they're always wanting to spritz. Your ribs looking dry is not a reason to spritz your ribs, okay? At least in my opinion. There are other reasons to do it when it gets a little bit too hot. But your ribs there's not enough fat like there is on like a brisket or a pork belly or pork butt where it's gonna continue to look wet. It's gonna be dry for a while until those that fat starts to render. There's a little, you can kind of see it right there. There's a little bit bubbles of that fat starting to come out. We're looking for more of that to be happening across the entire surface. Later on, without adding moisture, the fat from your ribs will start to make your ribs look a little bit glossier. With the pepper, and if I wanted to, I can flake a lot of this pepper off right now. And you don't want that. You want it to let it dry into the bark itself to create that texture. But if you keep adding moisture to it and you're cooking too low, it's hard to kind of get that texture to stick. But if you are going to spritz, my opinion is cook hotter. But I'm letting this just let it rock and roll and do its thing. So we're looking good so far. And the fire right now before I opened it was sitting about 285, and you know what, it's doing perfectly fine. So again, don't worry too much about your temps, but obviously everyone's temps are different, so don't go by my temps. Your temps will probably be different. All right, so it's been about 3 hours or so since we looked at our spare ribs, and it looked really good. So again, on that back end, we didn't get any of these bones that were starting to curl up or anything like that, so that's a really good sign. Also, again, we didn't spritz or do anything with these, but again, that pepper is where we want it to be. It's nice and even. But for me, when I'm checking for ribs, one thing I'm doing is I'm feeling for kind of like where this rib tip area is, and seeing how soft it is. And I'm kind of giving them a nice little poke and just trying to feel for that fat that's underneath or in between the meat and like the two layers of meat. There's that fat band, and I want to see how soft it is. They're almost ready, not quite ready to wrap yet, but one thing that I want to do now, you don't have to do this all the time, and this is kind of like the same thing that people do when they're wrapping, when they flip ribs, is giving some time to sometimes it's to kind of get color on the back of the ribs, like on the membrane side. On this particular pit, I usually don't have to flip them that way. It usually gets pretty good color on the bottom, but one thing that I do want to do is make sure that I render out a little bit more of this fat right here before I put them into foil. So I'm going to give these a little quick flip, and we're going to give it a little bit more time. One last thing I wanted to add at this part of the spare rib cook. you can bump up the temp just a little bit and have it a little bit higher, because right now we got the color set, the pepper is starting to kind of become part of the surface of the rib. And right now, because it's kind of like the same idea as when we're cooking brisket, where we want to render out that last bit of fat before we go into wrap, this is kind of like the same deal. So you know, if you're usually cooking at like 275, you can put it at like 285 for you know, for the next, you know, 15, 20, 30 minutes or so. But if it's the color's not set, if it's still feeling a little bit too tight, because just like anything else that we cook, like everything's gonna feel super loose, then it's gonna tighten up, and as those muscles kind of start to relax, the fat starts to render, it's gonna soften up a bit. So if it hasn't started its slow softening after being really tight, then I wouldn't bump up the temp yet. Wait for it to soften, then you can bump up the heat a little bit more to help that rendering process happen a little bit quicker, and then we can start going to wrapping. These things, obviously, even though I said, yeah, we're in between a range of 250, 285, 300, whatever, but it's just really reading not just your temps, but it's being able to like feel your ribs, feel anything that you're cooking, and seeing at what stage of the cook that's at, and that'll help you kind of determine, okay, you know, on this pit, it's probably best to cook at this temp rather than this temp. It might be better to cook, you know, way hotter or way lower, but it also depends on how many ribs you're cooking on your pit too. So a lot of elements, a lot of factors. So I know people always want to find that one way to cook ribs. There's really not. It's just going to take a lot of practice for you guys to figure out exactly, you know, how you want to get those ribs to be. All right, guys. So we're about, let's say, we're about exactly 4 hours 10 minutes into this cook. But now after we flip those ribs, I don't know if this is the sign right here. Okay, I don't know if you guys are gonna be able to hear this, but if I bring these up to you, so in that case, what I'm listening for is basically that squishiness, is that sign that that fat between is starting to render, that it's a little bit loose, but it's not so loose that it's slipping off. Sometimes if it cooks down too much as you're doing this poke test, that that meat that's like that rib tip area will start to slide off, and we don't want that, because especially if we're trying to get the rest of this rib, like the meat that's like in between the bones, to be tender. By the time we get that tender inside the foil wrap, that rib tip section is probably going to be overcooked. Okay, so we want to make sure we get it to a point where that rib tip section is on its way. We want to get it to that point where it's going to kind of carry through in the wrap, but we don't want to get it to where it's overly cooked here, because the meat in between the bones still needs more time, probably at a higher temperature with a little bit moisture, with some sauce inside that foil wrap. If I'm doing this in my backyard, usually it'll take me 3.5 hours to get to this point, but just because we've been open and closing this pit, checking out other things and shooting videos, you know, obviously it took a little bit longer. Work off of these cues and not just worry about, you know, times and temps and all that kind of stuff. You know, all that stuff matters, but at the end of the day, if it's not ready, it's not ready, and if it's overcooked, then it's overcooked. All right, let's get to wrapping these ribs. And I know people were saying that, like, because of my the foil video that I made, people are like, oh, Joe hates Reynolds wrap, blah, 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 blah. That's not true. The Yim household is a Reynolds wrap family. Alright? The only thing I was saying is that generally Reynolds wrap is not wide enough for the spare rib. So, not dogging Reynolds wrap. We're going to, like I said, when I was making this this barbecue sauce in my last video, I said how I like to keep it slightly thicker, because then I can kind of control the viscosity. So now, since it is a little thick, I'm going to add a splash of apple cider vinegar to it just to thin it out. I don't like my sauce to be super thick inside the wrap, because it's going to continue to reduce inside there. Sometimes if you're cooking too hot and your sauce is too thick, something that might happen that there's so much concentration of like ketchup that it starts to get pasty, and it starts to bubble, and it creates a weird coat on top of your ribs. So that's the main reason why I start off with the sauce thick, just to kind of figure out where I want it and how I want to serve it, and then add apple cider vinegar to thin it out. So here we go. Start off, we're gonna just put. Usually I do this with a spritz bottle. It's dang wind. I'm going to just pour it on because I don't have a spritz bottle today, and we just want enough on here to cover the surface of how big that rib is going to be. Also, the thing that people sometimes do is they put or they spritz apple cider vinegar on here. Because we added vinegar to the sauce itself, we don't really need to do that unless you want it to be a little more liquidy. But I think that usually if you add too much liquid in here, the color of your ribs do tend to fade, so which is why I'm not doing it in this case. I'm gonna go meat side down, and then a little bit more sauce on the top, not too much, because we're getting most of the sauce on the meat side anyway. So this is what it's gonna look like. So everyone has their preferred way of wrapping ribs. This is just kind of the way I prefer to do it. And again, even though I'm being super particular, it's because when you're like doing a bunch of these, you need to have a routine of steps how to do it, so that like you get into the zone and you can do it really quickly. So I guess for myself, it's always kind of like left over here, then it's right, bottom, and then you're kind of crimping that top corner, and then you're pressing down like that. Okay, so again, this is just how I've decided that I'm gonna do ribs, and now it's in a really tight pack. Also, just to make sure that right here, I wasn't really too worried about like bones poking out on the sides, because we trimmed these ribs really well so that we didn't have any bones sticking out. And if they do, just pull them out before. You guys all know it. You guys seen so many barbecue videos now. If you see bones sticking out, just pull it out. Left, right, bottom. And as we're doing this, we're kind of pulling towards that rib so it stays nice and tight. If you keep it loose, you're gonna have a lot of steam coming out, and it's gonna discolor your ribs. Okay, so pull it tight. So that's it. So we're gonna keep these ribs on here. I don't know, they felt pretty good, so I'll probably check on them about 30-40 minutes or so. I don't really like letting them go past an hour. Usually if it goes past an hour, like I said, the color tends to fade, the flavor starts to fade. Everything just becomes a little more muted when it tends to be wrapped too long. So I'll check on them again 30 minutes. Temperature wise, what temp should you be cooking at when it's wrapped? Most people say 300. I would say it's just more so like, that temp that I said that you were comfortable with putting your smoker when you flip the ribs or the rib tips towards the fire, where it was a little bit hotter than you were cooking the rest of the time. That higher temperature should be the temp that you should be cooking at. Some pits it's only 285, some are 300. It's up to you to decide. It's something that you're going to play around with by undercooking ribs and then overcooking ribs and then finding that middle. So it might take a couple cooks to figure out. Alright guys, so we just pulled these off. So they were on for about, I would say close to about 35-40 minutes or so. What we're looking for is that the same rib tip section, that thick part of the rib that we were feeling for pre-wrap, is the same thing that we're feeling for now. We want it to be pillowy soft, okay? Similar to like when you're pulling a brisket and that moist and feels that same sort of tension. That's the kind of same thing that we're feeling for. We're trying to feel for rendered fat and also like the tenderness of the meat itself. The other thing that's gonna, obviously you can't feel it because the cartilage is gonna feel the same no matter what until you take a knife to it, but at least I don't really like my cartilage to be super white. I like to be, I don't want to say translucent, but I enjoy eating that part of the rib itself, so I do like it's where it's starting to get translucent, where it's soft enough where you can bite it. I don't like it when it's too rock solid, because then to eat all the meat around that cartilage becomes a challenge, and that meat, it tends to be a little bit too tight. We're gonna let this rest just for a few minutes, just like any other meat. Even though it feels really good right now, if you try to open this thing up and cut into it, just like any meat, it's just gonna fall apart. So as much as I would love to be able to cut into this right now, finish this video so I can go take a shower, I'm gonna wait. Alright, we had some major issues with lighting outside, so I decided to bring it inside to at least do the final reveal, just so that you guys can actually see exactly what we're dealing with here. Alright, so you can see right there all that liquid that's there, right? And it's running. That's what we're looking for. That's the juice that we want. We flip this over. I don't know about you guys, but I am pretty dang happy about those ribs right there. That even color, that even pepper. There's no paprika, no any other color or other spice that's getting that color. Remember, we got a lot of that color from the smoke. Obviously, the sauce does give a little bit of color to it for sure, but a lot of it has to do with just making sure that we're doing these little things right, controlling the smoke, controlling even temps, pulling, wrapping at the right time. Let's get into slicing these ribs. I'm gonna try my best to do this. I haven't done it in a while successfully, kind of going through an entire rack of ribs without hitting bone, but let's try our best here. The groove in between the bones will tell you, and you know, you're just really kind of feeling for it with your knife. If you feel like you're hitting bone, you can kind of, you know, tilt your knife a little bit to the side and kind of find your way through. I get through that rib tip area first, and then just kind of pull through. But again, same thing like when you're cutting brisket, guys. You want to keep that side of your thumb as a guide, just to make sure that knife is going straight through. All right, let's take a look at that rib right there. Nice and juicy. I'm not a huge, there's a smoke ring kind of guy, but there is a smoke ring. And you can tell, like, I don't know if you can see that, but on that cartilage right there, it is white, but on the very edges of it, it's starting to get a little translucent, and is what we're looking for. And that way, I could tell that it's going to be soft enough to bite through. These ribs are really, really juicy. You can see that one. You can see it pouring through, but it's looking really nice, guys. Yeah, it's pretty good. I haven't had a rib in quite some time, so it's pretty good. I actually really like these ribs a lot, because I don't really love a super saucy rib. I think that has to do with like growing up and always having ribs like that, so having something like this is a really nice departure from it. There are ways where you can add more complexity to the rib and add more layers of sweetness and things like that, but for me, like I said, I don't know, I like it when it's a little bit muted, a little more focused on like the flavor of the pork rib itself. And this is probably my preferred way of cooking ribs just in general anyway. I just feel really confident when I'm cooking ribs this way, probably because I've done them like a couple thousand times now. In terms of like getting the feel right for a rib, like this one is the one that I always kind of lean on. I don't cook a lot of other types of ribs, but I use this as a template to kind of remind myself, like, okay, during a certain stage of the cook, like, I need to make sure my ribs reach this level of tenderness, or they should feel this way, or the fat should look and feel this way, or the rib should smell this way. And I use a lot of cues in this particular cook to kind of help me figure out how my other rib cook should go, even though it's not necessarily a spare rib. So I hope that this video helps a lot. I know a lot of people have been asking for this video for a really long time, probably over a year now, you know, this is, again, my way of doing it. It doesn't have to be yours. I hope that it'll help you to create more consistent ribs. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, make sure you like, subscribe, share this video with friends, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. And I guess I'll see you guys next time.